Hello, my name is Eliza Urwanowicz-Rojecka. I'm from Arsenal Gallery in Białystok team, and I am the co-curator of the exhibition Our Child, together with Jitka Hlewackowa and with Zuzana Stewkowa. We would like to invite you for the lecture of Saskia Byler as a part of a public program connected to the exhibition. The exhibition is presented at Arsenal Gallery in Białystok, Poland until 30th of August, and is co-financed by the Minister of Culture and National Heritage. And I would like to thank Saskia Byler for taking the invitation and giving the lecture on caring infrastructures. And I would like to introduce you shortly Saskia Byler, who is a researcher, writer, and curator working at the intersection of care, gender, and socially engaged art. Saskia earned her practice-based PhD from the Zurich University of the Arts at the University of Reading, drawing on her participatory curatorial program on care during her time as an artistic director of M1 at the Arthur Boskamp Stiftung. This research led to her book Caring Infrastructures, Transforming the Arts Through Feminist Curating. And as the co-founder of Caring Culture Lab and member of the art collective Mothers, Warriors and Poets, she builds discourse and platforms to advance the structural transformation of the art sectors towards more care and inclusivity. She has worked internationally within the arts, including at MoMA, PS1, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and the Verily Center for Art and Politics. Currently, she's a senior researcher at HED Genève, where she investigates cultural participation in Switzerland. Thanks again, Saskia, for taking the invitation. Hello, we are here waiting for you. Looking forward all day for your speech. So yeah, I will give you the floor right now. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I don't see you, but I hope all of you are coping okay with this heat. I heard that where you are, it's also 38 degrees like it is here. So I'm in a dark room with a ventilator in my back. I hope you have some sort of air circulation where you are sitting. And yeah, let's dive into this presentation. It's an honor for me to be here virtually. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come in person due to logistical issues. But yeah, I hope that nonetheless you will be able to take some sort of inspiration from this lecture. And after my talk, we will also take time to answer your questions. So I will be able to hear you and we can engage in a conversation together. Yes, so I will start. The lecture is called Caring Infrastructures, Making the Art World Accessible for Caregivers, as this is in the context of the exhibition and the public programming of Our Child. So actually, we are taking on the perspective not so much on making the art world accessible for children per se. There can be synergies, but it's actually really focusing on parents and other caregivers and how they can become part of, not become part, but actually stay part of the artistic field. And as Elisa already mentioned, I wrote a book called Caring Infrastructures, Transforming the Arts Through Feminist Curating. This is my PhD dissertation, and my lecture is sort of based on that research, but also on the curatorial practice. So the first question that I would like to address is, why should we even talk about care? Why is this something that matters? we might just take it for granted and expect that it's something that is always there. But this already takes us to, I guess, one of the core issues around care. So I want us to take a closer look at the notion of care. There are many different definitions and approaches out there of how to frame care. I particularly like this one, so I'd like to read it to you. It's from Bengi Akbulut, and she writes, "Care work is a basic form of labor that sustains social life and enables any kind of social system to function. It is a field that all of us draw upon to survive. In that sense, care work is a commons. It is the most fundamental basis of social reproduction to which we all contribute and to which we all owe our existence." The reason why I like to start with this quote is because it shows us that there's no escape from care. And also, none of us are outside of the field of care. All of us are here because we have received care from the very first second of our lives and will continue to need care until the last second of our lives. And also, all of us are caregivers and care receivers at the same time. So we all engage in a sort of web of caring relationships, and this is really the fundament sort of to human life, to any kind of life that we build as humans, but of course also in conjunction with other species. So this perspective is important because very often in political discourse, care is seen as a kind of niche, something that only concerns a sort of smaller group of people, often geared towards women or people with disabilities or children, but it's not really seen as the most basic thing that really sustains all of us. So I think this framing is important. And if we do take that serious, that care is the most basic and existential thing that sustains us all, we might think, well, then it's something truly beautiful that we should all engage in. But there is a kind of, I don't know if downside is the right term, but there are certain mechanisms of exclusion. There are certain oppressive functions that appear when care work is performed. So if we look at the statistics around care work, we can see the kind of injustices actually that underpin the field of caregiving. And usually, depending on the country where I speak, I try to adjust the numbers to the specific country. I'm not very familiar with the Polish context, but I did some reading. And now instead of only focusing on Poland, I actually thought it was interesting to contrast Germany, which is where I'm based, and Poland. And I know there are some people in the audience that also have either lived in Germany or are based there. So I thought maybe that dialogue could also be interesting in the framework of today's event. And just one note up front, I took these figures from different papers and different sources, and they're all listed in the sources, but not all of them can actually be compared per se because there might be different, they come from slightly different years, or were produced with a different methodology. So if one of you is like a professor of statistics, you might consider what I'm doing here a crime, but I'm actually just trying to show this, that there are different cultural norms and different economic systems where care is organized in a different way. So let's look at this with curiosity, but also with that knowledge that, yes, there are different sources, different years, and yet they're still fused together to create a kind of narrative. So both in Poland and in Germany, we have something called a gender care gap, where men perform less care work, unpaid care work, than women. In Germany, it's 44% that women perform more unpaid care work than men. And in Poland, it's 74%. So we actually see a quite similar structure here. And when we look at the employment rates of caregivers, so in this case, parents, we see that 66% of mothers who are employed actually work in part-time, and only 7% of fathers work part-time, meaning that we still have this very traditional breadwinner model where the father goes to work and the mother stays at home with the children, engaging in sort of, part-time economic activity. And what I was able to find for the Polish context is that, so I couldn't find the exact equivalent of this study, but I could find the figures that fathers' employment rates is over 90% and that of mothers is over 70%. But from this figure, only 10% work part-time. So it's from this data, and you can tell me if this is different from your lived experience, that it's more common for Polish mothers to actually exit the paid workforce altogether rather than to engage in part-time work. And I thought this was interesting as a kind of mechanism of how different societies and economies deal with questions of care that we all know needs to be performed by someone. So another interesting thing that I would always like to note is that when now we've spoken about a sort of heterosexual couple with children, if they do split, in most of the cases, the child or the children stay with the mother. In Germany, these are 88% of the cases, and in Poland, 82%. And then there is an interesting figure that is called lifetime motherhood penalty. And this calculates, so this doesn't compare men and women, but actually women who have children and mothers. No, the other way around. Women who don't have children and mothers. And so here we can see a gap. If a mother in Germany has up to 3 children, she will lose around 70% of income compared to a woman who does not have children. And in Poland, the figures are a bit different, and I wasn't able to find sort of an exact study on the lifetime motherhood penalty, but that it was around 10% per child as a wage penalty. So less than in a German context. And Germany has one of the highest motherhood penalties. And of course, this has to do with sort of childcare structures, but also prejudice against mothers, that they would be unreliable when they want to return to the workforce, and that they do enter in part-time so often, of course, earning less than somebody who would work full-time. And then at the end of a woman's life, they are also confronted with less pension. In Germany, it's almost 40% lower than men's pension, and in Poland, it's around 15%. So what these figures show is that care is quite complex. There are a lot of ambivalences. And yes, it's easy to romanticize care, but this is a kind of reality check that shows that engaging with care comes with different costs, at least when we talk about sort of economic costs, but also costs of sort of social participation and political participation. And what we also note here in the data that I've shown is that very often it's only data that focuses on men and women, so it remains within the gender binary and doesn't even capture queer, trans, and non-binary people. So we actually are still lacking the data in order to assess how care work affects their lives, or how it is distributed amongst these couples. So one might ask, well, if this is the reality around care, why do people still engage it? And in many cases, why do women still take on the role of caregivers? And I'm sure many of you are aware that this is really a kind of process of socialization, that we are socialized to care for others, for our partners, our parents, our children, for our communities. And it is often connected with this narrative of the labor of love. If you've been engaging with feminist theories from the 70s onwards, this was a very sort of dominant critique that because we love our children and our partners and our communities and our parents, we do this love for free, this labor for free because we love them. And that is sort of one part of the medal. Yes, we might sort of get effective remuneration. We might enjoy this practice of caring for others, but at the same time, repeating that narrative that we should not demand sort of equal distribution of care work or a kind of economic recognition of it also conceals the dependencies and the inequalities that define care as this feminized labor, that it's natural for us to do this, right? And I'm sure many of you also work in the cultural field, as do I. And I've noticed that this is a very common trope. It's a very common narrative that also in the cultural field, you are expected to do a lot of work out of love, out of passion, out of dedication for your own work, for the art as a whole. So exhibition participations and all of that is often unpaid, as I'm sure you know, or poorly paid. And the expectation is equally here that we do this, out of love. And I think this is a very interesting, sort of parallel between the artistic field and the field of care work. And the question now is, because now we've looked at the field of care and of gender, and now I'd like to look more specifically on the field of gender and art. So what happens when those come together? And I may say that also here we have forms of discrimination and exclusion that happen. To cite more figures, not the whole presentation is going to be numbers, I promise, but a few more. So to start with the gender pay gap, we've spoken about the gender care gap, and now the gender pay gap is the gap between what men and women earn. And here again, I've been trying to contrast Germany and Poland. I've found quite different methods and figures for the Polish context that ranged from 4 to 6 to 8%. And then it differs a lot if it's the public sector or the private sector and so forth. But now for the sake of consistency, I've used the figures of Eurostat from 2024, and both the figures from Germany and Poland are from the same study, comparing them. So we can see, according to these methods that they've applied, that Germany has a substantially higher gender pay gap than Poland. Poland has one of the lowest gender pay gaps across Europe. And the question, though, is what happens when women enter the cultural field as a field of work, as a professional field? And here there are figures for the German context that are quite alarming, that women earn up to 35% less in the visual arts, film, and design, than their male counterparts. In Poland, the figures that I was able to find, they're from 2017, but they suggest that this gap is less than 10%. But the study also said that in general, the wages are much lower than the average national wages. So the study here cited that per month it's around 1,000. I tried to, sorry, I tried to learn how to say, it's not Swati, sorry, it's Swati. Is that right? Yeah, I cannot hear you. Okay, you can read it on the slides. Anyway, so that the income in general is lower, but it's not so gendered how it is distributed. And so cultural jobs are considered, according to the study, to one of the least paid jobs in the Polish economy. So precarity is there nonetheless, but it's not so highly gendered as it is in a German context. One thing that we can sort of measure is the economic participation. The other thing is in terms of visibility, right? Who gets shown in exhibitions, who receives awards, and so forth. And the same study, on the bottom in the source, you can find the full source. You can find the paper online if you're curious. And here it was listing relevant awards in the cultural field in different disciplines. And you can see the distribution between men and women recipients, and that actually across all disciplines, men had around between 70 and 80% of the prize recipients. So one thing is the economic discrimination, but we can really see there is a sort of discrimination in the recognition of the work of women artists in the Polish cultural field. And this is a real discrepancy because the same paper also cited that I think Polish art students are it was over 70% are female. But then those that are able to have a career and be successful and be visible, according to this study, is really much more male-centered. And so the question is, now we've looked at the question of gender and art and what happens when we take care into the equation. And unfortunately, we must suspect that care does play a central role in creating sort of this gap of participation in a successful artist's career. And in order to, sort of test this hypothesis, I have started, and there is an earlier counting of this in my book, but these are the newer numbers. I've tried to count or look at the 10 most successful artists according to a German study called Kunstkompass. And so it's a global study. It lists 100 most important artists, not actually looking on sales so much, but on conference participation, important biennials, Venice, Documenta, and all of that. And if we look only at the 10 most successful artists, we can see there are only 2 women here. The others are men. And we can also see, so this was the additional work that we had done, that we tried to find out their parental status to understand, do they have children, and if so, how many? And sometimes it's not easy to even find that data. So we can see that the 2 women that did make it into the top 10 do not have children, and all of the men in that top 10 do have children, and in total, actually 24. So what happens when we look at the 10 most successful women and the 10 most successful men separately? First of all, we can see that on the left side, when we look at the female artists, we have to go all the way down to rank 42 to find the 10 most successful women artists. And for the men, we only have to go down to ranking number 5 in order to source the 10 most successful men. Anyways, so what we can see here on the left side is that the women artists from these 10, only 4 of them have children, and actually each of them only has 1. And interestingly, if we look at the men, we can see that all of them have children, and in total, 35 children, and Jeff Koons has 8 children. I've looked around at one point to see if I could find interviews where he was asked how he was able to juggle his artist career having 8 children. I have not found that interview. If you find it, please share it with me. But basically what this kind of short exercise or study shows is that whether a father has children or a mother has children is really perceived quite differently, and it comes with different barriers. And this is, of course, associated with the idea that women are the primary caregivers. And I think this is important because often we use the sort of more inclusive term of parenthood rather than speaking about motherhood in the arts particularly. But if we look at these figures, we really have to say that mothers experience a much larger sort of discrimination in the cultural field compared to men. And yeah, I think it's important to speak about parenthood as a general term, because eventually we do want all genders who care for others to have sort of the same conditions and the same support structures. But as a kind of analysis of the status quo, we have to be quite particular to say that there is a difference of how it is perceived and the kind of opportunities and support structures that are out there for mothers versus fathers. So the question that arises from this is, how can we think art and caring responsibilities together? Does it have to be the way that it currently is? Many of you might be aware that the word curating comes from the Latin word curare, to take care, to worry, to attend to. And historically, this has been understood as a sort of physical caretaking practice of art objects, of collections, of artifacts. And as the art world is advancing and sort of more performance and social practice becomes more dominant, also the roles of the curator has shifted. And I argue in my book that we actually constantly have to renegotiate what this association between curating and care is. So I wrote, we have to articulate in thought and in practice how we can attend responsibly to matters of care from our respective position of power. So there's no blueprint, no default, schemata or method to say this is how you are a caring curator, but it depends really on your context. And as I mentioned earlier, my book also grew out of my own curatorial practice. In 2019 and 20, I was the artistic director of a small art space in the north of Germany. It's located in a small town of 6,000 inhabitants. And the question here was, or the goal was, to engage the local community, the local caregivers, into the cultural programming and to address questions of care on different levels. So I will not talk about all the formats in detail, but on the first column, you can see that there was a workshop series called Care for Caregivers, and I will give an example of that in a second. Then we also tried to advance the discourse and artistic productions on questions of care, and we gave 2 artist awards, one of them to Maternal Fantasies, and if I'm not mistaken, they're in the room. So we have worked together in the context of this project. And in the third column, we try to think, what kind of support structures can we build now that can outlast sort of my curatorial fellowship at the institution? And so in this programming, much more than centering on objects, I was focusing on sort of creating a platform for encounter and network. So I understood my curating not so much as an object-centered curatorial practice, but as a relational practice. And somehow I hoped to contribute in a meaningful manner to the everyday life of the community, and that it would not be an isolated practice, but would form part of a larger social movement, so to speak, right? So for example, in the German context, the movement of the care revolution was a term that a few years ago was quite dominant. So to think what kind of social struggles and movements can we become part of with our artistic and cultural practices. And more than producing sort of tangible exhibitions or objects, it was really thinking through the idea of infrastructures. What kind of support structures do we need to create this kind of platform for encounter? And all of this occurred, as you saw, in 2019 and 20. And of course, these were the years where the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. And there was all of a sudden so much talk in public discourse and media about care, which on the one hand was really great. But it also created a kind of trend to engage with questions of care that in a way seemed kind of like symbolic action, and that didn't always trigger a kind of fundamental change to the situation of those who actually perform care work. And the London-based Care Collective has coined the term care washing as an equivalent to greenwashing and pinkwashing. So where companies, but also cultural institutions take on the term of care and print it on bags, for example. And I'm not saying that you can or should not do this, but the question that it sparks as well, what is the meaning of care in the context of this organization that goes beyond printing these words on that bag, right? And in the cultural field, also, I guess, just sort of intensified by the COVID pandemic, was that a lot of cultural programming on questions of care emerged, but with a discrepancy of actually not providing care for caregivers. And this meme by Hetty Judah, I think, just kind of nails it. Because yes, art institutions are often eager to do an exhibition about care, but not actually providing the support structures that caregivers need. And this is kind of, in a meme form, the core of my book. And there's another quote by a US-based initiatives, Museums Moving Forward, that I think also really speaks to this. And I'm going to read it. They say, simply put, it is not enough to diversify the artists we are collecting or exhibiting. We must take better care of our people too. So this kind of pushes us to think through the artistic field as a social ecosystem, and to really think about all the invisible things that take place in the cultural field that are quite complex. And all of this enables a kind of outcome that we can see in an exhibition, but often everything that occurs in the background is invisible to us. We often do not know, are interns being paid? How are the contracts? Are they only for 6 months or renewed every year? Are they long-term? How much is the distance in pay between the director and the cleaning staff? So there's so much sort of tension and hierarchies and invisibilities that sustain cultural production, but that we as audiences actually never get to see. But that's the kind of perspective that I want to bring to the discussion when I speak about caring infrastructures. And infrastructures, of course, are also something that occur in the background that we often don't see. We rarely see the pipes that our water run through, or where the internet comes from, which is a question my child asked me today. So there's a lot of infrastructure that we take for granted, and we actually only realize that it's there when there is a problem, right? So this invisibility, the underlying support that enables something else, kind of became the core of my research. And caring infrastructures might sound abstract, but there is a quote by Donna Petrescu that I find really, that sort of describes what I want to speak about with caring infrastructures in a nice way. And I will read it. Support is behind, below, and underneath, hidden. It is the invisible that makes possible the visible. The absent, which allows things to be present. The transient, which makes things lasting. The impossible that carries on the condition of possibility. And I think this question of conditions of possibilities, what kind of conditions do we need to create in the cultural field? What kind of support structures do we need for caregivers to be present? So I tried to think through this question and to provide something to my peers, to us as a cultural field of practitioners, as a kind of methodology. So something that could be applied and reproduced, adapted to the specific context, rather than care being something that we just ascribe to women, for example, because we think they're naturally socialized to care, right? So how can care become a practice, a method independent of a kind of gendered or racial association? So caring infrastructure in my idea was to create a curatorial method for the building of support structures that respond to the caring needs of the artists, collaborators, and audiences, and to foster the conditions of their presences. And here you can see that I write about the artists, collaborators, and audiences, and very often a lot of museums put a lot of work in creating, let's say, a diverse audience, but are not so much concerned in creating support structures that different people with different needs can be part inside the institution or as freelancers when they collaborate with the institution. But I think it's important, again, to think through the ecosystem with these different perspectives. So in a way, just to have some pre-points, and I will come to the practice of it in a bit. Basically, caring infrastructures are a way to recognize sort of the essence of feminist care ethics, so that we all give and receive care. None of us are outside of that. And that we practice what we preach, so that the thematic focus and the organizational structure are not in contradiction to each other. And that these invisible infrastructures must be somehow redesigned as infrastructures of care and also become visible and sort of tangible as such. And so in my book, I wrote a soft manifesto for caring infrastructures that has sort of 8 subgroups. I called them kind of building blocks. So the idea was that you can take smaller elements of your project and look at them separately and say, okay, what do we need, for example, to make our budgets more inclusive? And I will walk you through some examples. And the idea, again, that it's a methodology that can be adapted to whatever context that you're working in. So the first proposition was the question of how do we situate ourselves? Here I wrote, gain a sincere understanding of the context. When embarking on a new curatorial project, hold space and time for observation of the context and for deep listening to the community before developing public programming. This allows the project to emerge from the context rather than become an external imposition. And so this has to do with just the modus operandi of the arts being that you have to move for a curatorial position or for an artistic project for 3 months, and then you already have to apply to the next thing, and it takes you to a different context. And oftentimes it's so like there's so much hyper production going on and hyper mobility that we lose the time and the sensitivity to the context. And if we think about creating sort of a meaningful programming for a specific context, we do need to make time and space for that process of situating. So for example, when I started my job at M1 that I mentioned earlier, I was also asked even before my position started, hey, can you give us an overview of the opening dates throughout the next year so we can plan our vacation and, communicate it. And I was like, I haven't arrived. I've written a concept. I haven't been there. And I cannot sort of produce a public programming for the sake of public programming. And so I negotiated that I would have a 3-month sort of research phase before I would announce any public programming. And I engaged with really quite a lot of conversations with people in the community, trying to understand who cares for whom and in which forms, what are the kind of tensions and issues there that I could possibly respond to in a meaningful manner. And this, of course, also has to do with a kind of democratization of, care and caring through the process of curating. The third proposition, so as you can see, I'm not going through all 8. I'm just giving you sort of little snippets, but the book is available in open access, so you can download it for free as a PDF if you want to engage further. And then the question of accessibility, I think, is actually at the core, at least for me, from my understanding of what curatorial care is, should, or could be. And I think, so I'm just going to read proposition 3. There I wrote that here it's essential to provide care for presence. As a curator, create conditions for presence for a range of audiences, artists, and collaborators. Consider which curatorial choices in particular, which prerequisites, allow for the presence of whom. So what kind of support structures do we need that different social groups can be part of it? And I know this takes place in the context of our child, and the project that I was doing was centering on caregivers. So the question of an infrastructure for childcare was a very obvious choice to go to. But again, if you work on different topics and in different communities, that choice might be a different one, right? It doesn't make sense to have on-site childcare if your primary audience is maybe working with elderly people. Then you might need a different support structure. So, but in this case, the on-site childcare actually was a support structure both for the freelancing artists that were traveling there and often brought their children, but also for the audience members to participate on the weekends, but also for myself as a single parenting curator, I needed that support structure as well to be present, to be able to work on a weekend. And another invisible infrastructure is that of time. And I want to read from Hetty Judah just this sort of subtitle where she writes, how can you attend your own show's launch party if it clashes with children's bath time? And this might sound just a tiny bit funny or cynical, but basically the issue is that if you do have a caring responsibility that you will probably not have only for a week, but for years, for decades, and you cannot participate in sort of the social arena of the art world, then you fall out of the art system. If you cannot be present at openings, not talk about your work, not talk about your projects, not connect with others and sort of remind them that you are there, learn what others are doing, maybe collaborate, then this has really real consequences for your artistic career. So this timing is kind of the infrastructure that either enables or prevents that. And of course, there's no time that fits for all, but again, depending on your community and your sort of core audience, this is the kind of dialogue that one should be seeking. And interestingly, there's no price tag attached if you move an event from Thursday 8 o'clock to a Saturday at 11. There's no cost in doing that, but it changes who is able to participate. So we can have very small scale, and I call this micro-political action, And just to have a few ideas, it can be childcare on site, caregiver-friendly times for public programming. If you work in a rural context, maybe it's carpooling or shuttle buses. Think about what other kind of barriers you can lower in the space. It can be thinking about having enough breaks, maybe share a free meal in that break to create a sense of community and belonging. And it can also mean to communicate the support structures. For the event today, the translation into Polish is a support structure that was communicated. And I think this is really important. A support structure, for example, if you go to a theater or any kind of talk, can also be to say when the event ends, so that people understand, okay, if I need a babysitter, I can communicate how long the event is planned to be. So there are, again, small scale elements that often don't cost anything that make the art field more inclusive and supportive for caregivers. So proposition number 5, I dealt with questions of budgets that I consider actually the core political field of where care is negotiated. And I explain. So I think it's important that we acknowledge the capitalist framework under which art and curating are still subsumed, and take seriously the need for fair pay for all contributors. And this connects to a slide of the beginning, right? So beware not to equate artistic production and curatorial care with the exploitative narrative of a labor of love. So if we all live in capitalism and we all need to pay rent and childcare costs and food, we need to get paid for the work that we do. And if we don't, it creates a very unjust system that pushes a lot of people out of it. So, of course, it's not endless. We don't have endless resources in the cultural field, quite on the contrary. I need to drink some water, 1 second. So what we try to do, for example, when I was working at M1, is that we decided we would do one event per month, one workshop in the series of Care for Caregivers, instead of maybe doing one every weekend, for example. And this doing less events sort of freed up resources for us to say, okay, we're going to pay all of the staff and all of the contributors, and we'll pay them fairly. And if we do community events, there's also a payment offered to them, and that we could have enough resources to pay for the support structures of those that we work with. So if an artist would travel with their partner and children, that we would cover the extra costs of that travel. We turned a former gallery space into a children's room. We tried to spend our budget as locally as possible. And during the pandemics, we paid cancellation fees in order to support the freelancers. So all of this, in a way, is a kind of shift from a rather sort of object-centered care in the artistic field, especially in the commercial art sector, shifting towards people care and sort of the social ecosystem that sustains the arts. And again, returning to this notion that it is quite difficult in the cultural field to obtain budgets, the question is, well, maybe we have to rethink how we produce our events and how we think through them. Because if we only sort of budget for care at the very end, then it will always suggest that there's not enough money for it, right? So when I was writing it, I thought that maybe a curatorial degrowth agenda could be a way forward, where we sort of reduce the scope of a project to think, okay, maybe we do it smaller, or we extend, like if we're a small art space, we can do, I don't know, 3 exhibitions per year, leave them on longer instead of doing 6. And this frees up resources so we can pay artist fees. then a lot of the critique was, well, if we do that, we are less competitive with other cultural institutions. So it kind of actually has to be a political choice to do that. So making transparent that we have a scarcity of resources and that we try to think through them in a more sort of justice-driven agenda, that it can also inspire change across institutions, because ultimately we need this to be a collective change rather than an individual one. So the last proposition, and I'm realizing I'm talking long. I don't see you. I hope you're okay. This is the last one, I promise. So it's really important that we don't see this practice of building caring infrastructures as an isolated individual practice, but as one that is embedded in larger sort of social movements. So this is about fostering networks and alliances. Curatorial care recognizes the relational quality of its practice, actively connects and acknowledges existing social webs, and integrates itself into the social fabric of its site to foster alliances between art and non-art or community practices. What does this mean for the field of art and care? When I started this journey, this was in 2018, there was maybe 2 art and care initiatives, 3 out there in the German context that I was aware of. Now in 2026, we have so many, and I'll show you a slide in a second. And this was the first networking event that we did in 2024, where then we really came together physically on site, trying to understand what are we all working on, with this intention of really building a kind of movement and a kind of connectivity and collectivity of transforming the artistic field towards caregivers. So at this event, we had representatives from each of these initiatives that had sprung out like mushrooms across the past years in Germany, Switzerland, but also in other countries. And I'll talk about this in a second. And these are not even all of them that exist. These were just those who were present at that networking meeting. So from this, we created what we call the Caring Culture Lab. So it's a digital platform. It's a community-driven center for gender equity and care work in the cultural sector. So it provides information on the networks that are out there. And now we actually have a global list. And this initiatives from Poland is actually also on the list. And if you are part of another Polish initiative, please write to me, and there's a form on the website that you can fill, and we will update it on the website. And basically, if you click through it, you will see we are absolutely not alone. Around the world are art and care initiatives that are all working on this intersection of making the art world more accessible for caregivers. And I always say, look, if it wasn't an issue, then none of these initiatives would exist, because we all have time precarity, and we wouldn't engage us in that subject if there wasn't an issue. So it shows there is a structural discrimination that exists around the world, but there's also this powerful realization that we are not alone, that around the world, many mothers, some fathers, across disciplines are engaging in the struggle, in this movement for a more just and accessible cultural field. And last slide, the question is, and sometimes with the current political system, is, well, are we there yet? You know, sometimes it feels like we are getting so much further away from reaching sort of, realizing a society that is more just and more care-centered. So I want to read just the last 2 sentences from my book. Sorry to spoil that. And in the image you see, the image in the back is from Matrona Fantasies, who I guess are in the room. So I wrote, "Cultural practice that truly enacts care in all its facets remains visible on the horizon, but we have not yet arrived. The glimpses of its vision are the driving motor of the quest for an art sector that not only speaks about care, but that actualizes it through its infrastructures." So again, we might not be there yet, but collectively we have to push and not give up to sort of continue our drive and our journey towards reaching a society, but also a cultural sector that strives for care and equity and inclusion for those of us who care for others and those who need care to be present. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to ask our audience if maybe you have got any questions to Saskia.
Hello, and thank you for this wonderful lecture. I'm curious, what is your next plan in the field of care and creating the infrastructures of care?
That is a very good question. I don't know if it's a plan, but what I'm doing now is that I'm working on a research project of cultural participation. So for me right now, and I mean, this is not a super strategic decision, but I'm realizing that it's interesting to think through cultural participation, having and to think about it more in a general, larger term, rather than to be, I'm going to say, narrower on the social group of caregivers, and maybe to think more also on the different alliances of different social groups. And the research that I'm doing now will enable me to conduct different interviews and really to understand what is it that keeps institutions from doing the necessary work of opening up and of building support structures, but also what is already out there? What is the spectrum of amazing practices that are out there? So this is what I'm kind of on, but it's not necessarily the next logical step of this book per se. In general, this, like the last bits of it were written like in the end of 2023 before it was then published in 2024. And so this was still written before Trump was reelected, before in Germany the government collapsed, and now we have a much more right-wing conservative government than we had before. So a lot of things were still written, especially this last slide, with a more hopeful plea or a more hopeful vision that things could be different. And I am now really working hard on myself to sort of stay positive and to stay on track, that we can continue this thought. And for me, like as a consequence of this practice, is really how can we practice this sort of against all odds? How can we provide care for caregivers in times that are really anti-care, that are really anti-feminist, that are anti-democratic? I think that is the real challenge, and I don't have the answers yet. I don't know if anyone has, but I think this is, if there would have to be a next book, I think that would have to be the book. But yeah, this is just something that is on my mind. I don't know if it answers your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Saskia. We would like also to thank to our audience online and to our great translators. It is Tomasz Gierejko and Kasia Bondaruk-Augustyńczyk. Huge braves for them. And we would like also To thank all Arsenal team. Without my colleagues, that meeting won't be possible, as well as to our great tech team, Transmitujemy. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you.